Hey Phil, this is Cameron.
Hey, what's up, Cam?
Man, I gotta talk to you about something. Have you been watching the news?
Dude, what is going on? Pocket politics with Phil and Cam. Why? Why are we doing this?
I think it's gonna matter.
The only thing they want to talk about is guns and abortion.
My own views, I want to see the Republicans get away from the social issues.
I'm not saying that Republicans are idiots.
You hear something like that, it's powerful.
As an American, I was disgusted.
You could make the argument that you're probably more in the middle as well.
I think that's just a story that somebody's telling you.
Again, well, with the facts, this is true. Everybody knows
What
it.
facts?
So-
What facts? Who does this hurt more, Republicans or Democrats?
Boy, I've been thinking about that.
And welcome back to Pocket Politics. Another week in the books.
Yeah, there's definitely plenty to talk about this week. I know we've got some State of the Union stuff. We're going to talk some fallout from that, covering Social Security and Medicare. Speaking of State of the Union, we got some kind of an interesting tangle between Mitt Romney and George Santos. So there we'll get our weekly dose of George Santos in. We got a little news on congressional hearings. Former Vice President Mike Pence was subpoenaed, and we've got more balloons back in the news. Phil, why don't we get started?
Let's get into it. Yeah, so Biden gave his State of the Union on Tuesday. Quite the long speech. I believe it was like 73 minutes long, something like that. Don't quote me on that. But the speech overall went pretty well. So CNN poll that I think most people that follow politics as closely have seen at this point gave it kind of a 73% approval rating amongst all Democrats and Republicans and independents. What are your thoughts? How did it go?
From the standpoint of Biden, I think it gave him energy as far as the speech was concerned. And I say the energy, right? I mean, there had been a lot of discussion about whether he was too old to even be the president or to potentially run again in 2024. And so he came out and he showed people that he still had a little gas in the tank. As far as the substance of the speech, I mean, it was kind of back and forth as far as kind of your typical partisan speech, I guess. And there was obviously some back and forth with the other party. He did extend the hand some with some bipartisanship. But yeah, I mean, overall, again, I think Biden probably did what he needed to do. Now, I think it went over well with Democrats, not so much with Republicans, as we can expect, right? The question is, going forward, how he did with independents. Because as you and I have talked about in episodes in the past, that's really going to be the key constituent for him in 2024 is that independent vote. Just like we said, I think it helped him certainly in 2020. And Phil, I think you said it an episode or two ago, many elections nowadays, at least in the close states and closely contested elections, come down to that independent vote.
Yeah, but, we have talked about that quite a bit. But like I said, I cited that CNN poll, and that was 73% approval amongst all voters. That was the average. So it certainly showed the speech itself, at least, higher ratings amongst all three blocks of voters, which in my mind is a really good sign for President Biden moving forward. The other thing is you talk about the substance of the speech. There was largely a populist kind of driven speech, right? He talked a lot about, providing these benefits for everybody, working across the aisle. He talked about, funding college for those who want to go. And for those who don't want to go to college, we'll find good paying, jobs in the labor force. And he kind of touted that right on the back of the good week he had with jobs numbers and other things. So I think overall, this was a big win.
Yeah, I mean, it should be noted too, though, that throughout history, these State of the Union speeches, at least in the last 30, 40 years, have never really given presidents much of an upward boost or even that much of a downward boost. People may like them or not like them, but overall, they don't seem to help or hurt presidents' approval ratings all that much. I mean, you may see a % or two tick up or down. I think a lot of it, at least for right now anyway, will kind of stay status quo with him with his approval rating. which was only 41% going into this State of the Union address. And again, as you and I have talked about, those are numbers he wants to bump up. But again, to be fair, like I always try and be, I don't think this speech the other night really hurt him. And so, as I mentioned, though, there was some back and forth on there. And I think now political people have all heard about this heckling that's gone on. Some watched it. Some have heard about it the next day. Phil, I think you've got a clip for us to hear a little bit about the president and then the back and forth heckling, don't you?
Yeah, here we go.
Instead of making the wealthy pay their fair share, some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. Let me give you, anybody who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you a copy of the proposal. That means Congress doesn't vote. Well, I'm glad to see you. No, I tell you, I enjoy conversion.
And as you can see, I think he handled this really well. He was pretty quick on his toes. For an 80-year-old guy that's had a stuttering problem for all of his life, he did pretty good. Talking about enjoying the conversion. And I think this was a big win for him and the Democratic Party as a whole. The way they handled this, was this optically bad for the Republicans?
Well, so again, I don't think it helped him. I want to just say Kevin McCarthy had warned his caucus, don't heckle tonight. He even apparently had cited, during the Trump era when Nancy Pelosi tore up that speech, at the end when the cameras were on him, and McCarthy just said, hey, right, wrong, or different, I don't want any of that tonight. Just keep your mouth shut, clap when appropriate, and let's just be adults. Well, that didn't happen, right?
But is it? Yeah, and it's another demonstration on his inability to control his members in the House.
Well, some members. Now, I think the heckling itself, right? That's taken a lot of jabs. I mean, Democrats were certainly all over it. I heard Joe Manchin saying the heckling, he said, was awful childish and distasteful, and claimed this kind of thing might be acceptable in a third world country. Again, that was Senator Joe Manchin. Senator Dick Durbin, another Democrat out of Illinois, said it's really unbefitting for this. But he also took some heat from Republicans. And one of them was Chris Christie this past weekend on ABC on Sunday morning show. Phil, why don't we play that clip?
All right, here you go.
Address those issues.
Chris Christie, the Republican House members, at least some of them, certainly did seem to take the bait on Tuesday night. How big a mistake was that?
Big mistake. Look, you don't want to rise to the bait, and they did. A number of them did, and it was a big mistake. Look, the better response would have been to respond to that with laughter. If you really wanted to respond to the president saying something as ridiculous as the Republicans, because of what one Republican said, Rick Scott, which was immediately rejected by almost the entire rest of the party, what they should have done was just laughed at the president then and moved on. The yelling and the screaming stuff, look, I think that's always bad. It doesn't get you anywhere. And it gave Joe Biden an opportunity to engage them back in a way that was spontaneous, that I think was probably the best part of his entire speech.
And that's what Chris Christie had to say. What are your thoughts?
I pretty much agree with Chris Christie. Just let this go. Don't sink down to that level of heckling. And I mean, he's got a good point. You agree with it or disagree, just kind of laugh it off and keep moving. I think Chris Christie pretty much nailed it, Phil, don't you think?
No, I mean, I think his content wise, yes, he's very much correct. But he's missing out a couple of details. A couple of the details is he basically only talks about Rick Scott, and we'll get into it later. But it's not just Rick Scott. He is not the only one. Yes, he's the only one with a published plan to sunset Social Security and Medicare, but he's not the only one that's talked about it. And like I said, we'll get into that.
Yeah, it's not very many, but we'll talk about that in a minute here.
Yeah, and so the other thing is, he does, though, like I said, his commentary is very accurate. Whether you appreciate the guy or not, he's right. Maybe laughing would have been better. Maybe just keeping their mouth shut and not standing up and clapping would have probably been the best option, because that's kind of expected from the party not holding the executive branch.
I think the other thing to Chris Christie is, Phil, he's been there before, right? The guy, as we've talked about, he's been a governor. He's run for president in the past before, so he knows what it's like to get out there on the stage, and he knows what it's like to act appropriately when necessary. And I also recall during his time as governor, there's clips out there of him getting heckled and kind of being the adult in the room handling hecklers. So I think, again, as you just mentioned, whether you agree with him or you disagree with him politically, Chris Christie's been around the block a little bit. I think he makes sense with just telling people, hey, be the adults in the room on this. But again, going back to the speech, I think it delivered what Biden needed to do. He's not, let's be fair, he's not really known as a powerful speaker. Some presidents are, some aren't, right? Recent times, we've had people like Barack Obama, who is, known as a really vibrant speaker. Bill Clinton was back in the 90s, Reagan certainly back in the 80s, et cetera. I've never really considered Joe Biden in that category, for various reasons. But he showed, I think he did what he needed to do the other night. We'll see going forward. Phil, I got to ask you, does this help Biden in his potential run again for the presidency in 2024?
Absolutely. I think so. Amongst a lot of the Democrats, no matter what side of that spectrum you're on, right? Whether you're, more of a middle of the road, moderate, kind of Democrat, or if you're a, progressive liberal Democrat, I think that this, maybe makes you think twice about really trying to push for somebody else to take the nomination and not have Biden run. I mean, yes, he is old. Is he everything everybody in the party wants? No, but you're probably not going to get that anyway at this day and age. What he did do really well was he gave a really long speech. He put out, a bunch of ideas that I think a lot of Americans, Republican, Independent, and Democratic, can get along with. And, a very populist agenda. And he also was sharp on his toes, which, kind of signals that maybe he's not as
feeble-minded, maybe, as some of
feeble-minded or something like that. That he's definitely not as feeble-minded, right? Because he did have a couple of moments where he was able to go off the cuff and kind of show. So I think this does help him a lot. And I think, you mentioned State of the Union's not really making a big difference, but I also don't think they were always really as good, right? I think this was way more bipartisan than a lot of State of the Unions you hear, especially if you just compare the last administration, right?
Well, I was going to say it's interesting you say that, because he's been taking heat from some different writers saying they didn't think it was quite bipartisan enough for a guy who's promised to reunite the country. So kind of interesting that you say that. I mean, I don't know that I fully agree with the writers that it wasn't bipartisan enough. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think there were snippets of bipartisanship in the speech. We can always say there could be more, but to be fair, there was mentions of it. But one thing that I think was noticeably absent that I noticed was a limited mention of China. And I'm not the only one to have noticed that. I know I've been reading a number of people have been talking about it. And that China, I say that issue of China seems to be one of the few things that people on both sides of the aisle can get behind is standing up to China. And I didn't hear a whole lot about China the other night. There were snippets, but not a lot.
Yeah, I don't know where necessarily that criticism is coming from. So, I mean, if you look at the record of the administration alone, right, all of the Trump era trade regulations, which, depending on which person you talk to is good or bad for whatever reason, but a lot of those tariffs and stuff that the previous administration put on China, people thought President Biden was going to come in and stop that, and he never did, right? So a lot of that stuff still exists. I mean, he's obviously not going to get into the realm of like what's classified and stuff, but without, risking hurting our own economy, there's only so much that he can do, at least that is going to be available for the American public to know about,
So, yeah, and it is important to say, regardless of who the president is, Obama, Trump, Biden, whomever, right? these people are not dictators. They can't just snap their fingers and, make the country, everything and be all perfect, et cetera, et cetera. So that is important to keep in mind. But one more thing, though, for Biden is, again, with those low approval ratings, I know I keep hearing the administration touting his accomplishments and stuff. He's got to get the American people to buy it. And right now, I think there's a lot of people that are saying, hey, this may be good, or the jobs market may be trending up, but I'm still paying a lot of money for groceries and the gas and kind of these same standard talking points that people keep bringing up. But they do seem to be real kitchen table issues right now. And that's where the president, I think, needs to hit home at. Now, again, I don't think his speech the other night hurt him, but those are issues he's got to crack into if he's going to want to hold the White House. Because I will tell you, there was a poll released the other day, and I don't remember who it was from, but it was a pretty credible poll that actually had, in a hypothetical matchup of him and Donald Trump, Biden losing by 4. So he's got to be concerned about things like that.
Yeah. So keep in mind, we've also got to be concerned about polls in this day and age, right? Especially after the last 2 elections. But it's all we have to go on.
It's all we have to go on, though.
I agree, but don't you think a little bit of that criticism is unfair, especially when he's already put into place? Now, granted, it takes time for some of this stuff to take effect, but he's already put into place mechanisms to kind of, help put more money in people's pockets via jobs, right? He's using the mechanism to tax, to pay for some of this stuff by taxing, the wealthy a little bit more so that they pay a similar tax rate to what the middle class pays. And he even mentioned that directly in his speech, is building out for the middle class, right? And that's so when people talk about the price of groceries, they have to understand that corporate restraint and kind of, pulling the chain back on the level of capitalism that we allow to go unfettered in this country is part of that, right? Because if people want to sit around and say, well, capitalists should just be capitalists, and if they can figure out tax loopholes, they can figure it out. Those people, while saying that, never have the right to bitch about the price of anything.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
because if that's the way they feel, they should never complain about the price they're paying for anything.
So fair enough. But again, you and I can talk about it till we're blue in the face, just like any pundit on television. The American people have to buy it. And so far, overall, they are not, because he's underwater. And up until recently, and I haven't seen a poll to change this, he's underwater with his own party on whether he should even run again in 2024. So again, he's got to convince the masses. So far, he hasn't been able to do that. And I think we just need to see, again, in the coming months ahead, how he fares with that. But speaking of fireworks, we kind of alluded to it earlier, this whole push back and forth with his Social Security, Medicare stuff that came out the other night. Biden called out the Republicans for their stance on Social Security. To be fair to the president, as he said when he was standing on that stage, this isn't everyone in your party. And I think at one point he said, this isn't even the majority of your party, I don't think. But there are a few people. And then he went on to say, I'm not going to name them by name. But I think everybody had a feeling who that probably was, the one big one. And that was Rick Scott. As there are some others that have mentioned it. But that seems to kind of be the big takeaway out of this State of the Union, if you will, is this whole Social Security, Medicare thing. Phil, wouldn't you agree? Probably one of the big takeaways that's left everyone debating since then. Well,
I don't know what kind of debate there is on it. I mean,
well, according to many, there isn't one. I mean, yeah, I mean, getting rid of Social Security and Medicare is hugely unpopular. Right. And Rick Scott trying to do this under the failed guise of calling it sunsetting legislation, which, keep in mind, is completely absurd, because there's a ton of other legislation that we just can't afford, not literally with our pocketbooks, but just talking about things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis that Congress has legislated over the course of our entire country. We can't afford to let that stuff sunset every 5 years. Yeah. Right. So, well, and that was kind of the part of his plan. I mean, I was reading through his plan earlier. It's like a 12-point plan. The problem that he had was he didn't vet this through his leadership in the Senate. And his leader, Mitch McConnell, seemed to be, I don't know if I want to say taken aback, but I'll be honest with you. I think when Mitch McConnell was sitting there at the State of the Union the other night and he heard Biden go there on Social Security, I think the guy was vomiting in his throat, thinking, "Oh no, here's Rick Scott again, and here we go down this road." McConnell this week, in a radio address to, I believe it was a station in Kentucky, when interviewed about this, said, "Well, that's not my plan nor the Republican plan. That's the Rick Scott plan, and it's a bad plan." He went on to say Rick Scott now needs to be concerned about his own reelection in Florida, which has, more elderly people than any other state in the United States. So this is a plan when Rick Scott, it even was whispered about he was taking punches from his own party. To be fair, other Republicans, Phil, as you've mentioned, have talked about Social Security and possible cuts, namely Mike Lee and Ron Johnson are two other senators. I don't know exactly what their plans are, but Mike Lee has been pretty vocal about it in the past, and Johnson has hinted at it.
Yeah, so pretty much a day after the State of the Union, and while Biden is talking about certain Republicans wanting to get rid of Social Security and Medicare, he's standing there looking completely like appalled or like confused that he doesn't think that's a thing. And then this video surfaces of him saying, we're going to go in and uproot Social Security.
You're talking about Senator Lee, right?
Yeah, Senator Lee. And so
okay, yep.
The receipts are there. Maybe he changed his mind in a matter of weeks or months. Who knows? And then Ron Johnson wants to do something similar to Rick Scott, only he wants to do it on a yearly basis as opposed. Let me give you a novel idea, Cam. Is the cap for Social Security taxation, right? So you can only get taxed up to a certain income level, is around $160,000 a year, right? And and there's a lot of people out there, again, agree or disagree or like or dislike the guy, but Bernie Sanders has kind of said, hey, if, right now this is around 13 to 14% of the country's budget. That's including Medicare, Medicaid, along with Social Security, right? And it is by a whole one of the largest pieces of the government, right? Up there, only getting, really competition from defense, If he, Bernie Sanders kind of came out and said, if we just raise that to like 200,000, or maybe we stretch and go to 225,000, that reduces the burden on our government's budget by allowing these people. And he's like, look, when this program was designed in 1935, it wasn't designed to handle the amount of people. It wasn't designed for people living the amount of time that they're living today. So there are all these things, right? I'm totally for Social Security reform, but I think you got to keep it because God forbid you and I lose our retirement that we have paid significant money into for a long time, and not just our private retirement, right, that we've done, but a big portion of what we've invested for retirement was mandatory, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of American people. And if we lose that all of a sudden, that is a huge kill to something that we've paid taxes for our entire lives.
Yeah. So a couple of things there. You talked about Senator Sanders. Senator Mike Rounds, Republican out of South Dakota, he was on CNN this weekend saying that he is not for cutting Social Security at all, but he wants to shore it up. And he is, or he claims that there's already been some bipartisan discussion, him and some other senators. He didn't name them, but just said there's been some bipartisan discussion on it. And he hopes to continue moving forward so they can shore it up and make it a better plan. The other thing that I want to be clear with, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican minority leader, and Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy have said they are not for cutting this. I get it. There have been, and I'm not going to dispute it, some Republicans that have said they're for it. There are plenty that are saying they are not for, or some have said they're okay with looking at cutting it. Many others have said they're not. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any of the moderates that way, et cetera, et cetera. But Phil, I want to ask you this. We talked about Rick Scott a minute ago, and he's interesting because he's running for re-election in 2024. You and I have talked about this, how Florida has been trending red a lot. Is this now suddenly an avenue for the Democrats to possibly flip Scott's seat in 2024?
No. However, it is an avenue for another Republican to come in and flip Scott's seat, right? Rick Scott is under a lot of intense pressure from the leaders in his party right? McConnell's clearly not happy with him. We talked last week about Scott getting, blackballed from committees and not even knowing about it. He got the breakup text the next day.
And now he's getting called out by McConnell on the radio for having bad plans that he didn't vet through him.
Yeah, and now, people are resurfacing the thing that his healthcare company, right? I think he ran a hospital company, was basically convicted of one of the largest Medicare frauds that's ever happened in our country, and was forced to pay like something ridiculous, like $1.6 billion in fines, because they tried to fraud Medicare. That news is circulating. He bankrupted the Senate Election Committee, of which he was the overseer of, and causing, other Republicans, senators, to have to put their own, raised money into other races to help get Republican senators elected. Again, Florida's trending so far red. It is not a swing state anymore. I don't think you're going to see a Republican in that state, a Democrat in that state as a senator anytime soon. But I certainly think that based on the demographics in Florida and the bad press that he has seen, he stands no chance at another run for office. Now, The caveat to that is I'm basing that off if the election was next month. Turns out we've got some time for people to forget. And the memory span in the political world is very short, as you and I know.
Yeah, no, interesting thoughts, Phil, that you feel he's going to face a primary challenger, and that is interesting. Here's what I think. I think there are Democrats across the state of Florida right now that are standing there saying to themselves, who do we have in this state that is a credible name that we can drag out there to run against Rick Scott? I think Democrats are viewing him as vulnerable, and I think they're going to ratchet up the pressure on somebody noteworthy, nameworthy, big name, whatever you want to call it, in that state to try and run against him. And I think it could potentially be a close race. I agree with you, Phil, that it's trended very red, but you never know. It wasn't that many years ago that Florida was very much a swing state. So I don't think this is helping Rick Scott at all, between those in his own party that are upset at him, certainly the Democrats, etc. It'll be interesting watching that one go forward. The Democrats have
real quick.
They have a tough mountain climb in the Senate for 2024.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. But, before we transition to kind of our next topic, because I see us moving in that direction, there is a somewhat well-known Democratic congressman in the state of Florida, or as he so alleges, George Santos, that might be willing to run against him.
Yeah. Well, Phil, that's the perfect segue to our next topic. Mr. Santos, who was, he was at the State of the Union the other night, Phil, and he was right alongside the aisle there where the senators and the president walked in. And a certain senator out there didn't take too kindly to him standing there greeting everyone.
Yeah, so I think the most unfortunate thing about this is that we don't have really clear audio. There was no boom mic that they could have lowered in between Mitt Romney and George Santos while the interaction was going on. But the basically what we know is some slightly heated words were spoken between the two, and Mitt Romney had some comments for the press after the fact. What do you think about the optics? Did this, obviously George Santos, he's still there. I mean, it doesn't appear that he's going anywhere anytime soon. I've been saying that for 5 weeks now, I think, maybe 6. Who knows? I stopped keeping track, but
yeah. Well,
what are the optics on this? I mean,
as far as the optics go, the guy is getting slammed by a longtime politician and a man who's pretty well known, in obviously Senator Mitt Romney, and Romney slamming him. Let's face it, Mitt Romney is known as this, pretty kind man. I heard one reporter this week say, that he's covered politics for years, and he just said, it is bad when Mitt Romney has anything bad to say about you, or he even raises his voice. And he did both of those to George Santos. So he's like, clearly he was upset. Romney just came in and told him, supposedly, you don't belong here, said, this man should be sitting in the back row, not standing out here greeting senators and the president of the United States. Mitt Romney went on to say George Santos is one sick puppy. And then, Phil, I guess Santos turned around and started blasting him on press releases and on Twitter, kind of behind his back. Didn't he say, you'll never be president? And his remarks weren't very Mormon of him. I mean, Phil, are you with me? Are you? Oh, go ahead. I was just going to ask you, Phil, are you with me that it's pretty bad when Mitt Romney's assaulting or verbally assaulting you?
No, I agree, but I love the George Santos comment, of that not being very Mormon of Mitt Romney, because ironically it was not very whatever the fuck George Santos is of George Santos, right?
Yeah.
To come out and do that. The fact that this guy has the gall to be at the aisle and be out there shaking hands as this procession of, some of the most highly respected people walk down behind the president is just absurd to me in the first place. Like, I agree. Yeah, Mitt Romney's 100% right. He should have been sitting down in the back, just keeping to himself at this point. Lucky that he's still getting a paycheck from the American taxpayers.
Yeah, and another interesting twist out of this is Santos goes on to say that Kristen Sinema had kind words for him that night and kind of tried to cheer him up and, it's going to be okay and all this, that, and the other. And Santos is like, yeah, she's a really kind woman, unlike, Mitt Romney and all this, that, and the other. And then word gets back to Sinema's staff, and they talk to the senator, and she's like, I have no idea what he's talking about. I didn't even know there was a blow up between him and Mitt Romney until Senator Romney told me this himself. So she's like, he's lying about all this. She's like, I've never even spoke to the man, or something to that effect. So now he's, now he's going off dragging Kristen Sinema in this thing, who apparently she has nothing to do with it. And then, I don't know where it ends with this guy. And, speaking of the latest George Santos news, Mitt Romney calls him one sick puppy. That's ironic, because then news breaks this week that supposedly George Santos, a few years back, was in Pennsylvania buying puppies. I don't know if this was to resell them or what. And he was cutting bad checks for puppies. So it's just one story after another with this man.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, I just think overall it's, we've got this weird dynamic, and again, sorry for our listeners, we probably should consider recording some clips from the off the cuff phone calls that we have regularly. But you and I had kind of talked about this, but there is starting to be it's starting to appear that there's more and more of a dynamic of the House just being a little bit of a shit show, and the U.S. Senate is kind of side-eyeing or looking down upon the House as like, we're going to kind of clear ourselves from whatever's going on over there, and we're not a part of that, and taking the high road. Does this kind of further that, that narrative or that kind of line of thinking that, we're seeing?
Oh, I think it probably does. I mean, that's seems to be what Senator Romney was doing the other night, walking through there. I mean, maybe he thought in the back of his mind, hey, as I'm walking through and I see this man, if no one else is going to say anything, I'm just going to step up and tell him, you don't belong here. And I mean, I think it kind of does. I think there is kind of this feeling now that comes out about the senators in Washington, D.C. are kind of being the adults in the room. I think we're probably going to see more of that go on as the year goes on. But certainly Romney was not having anything to do with George Santos the other night. And it upset him enough that he, the normally kind of composed, stoic Mitt Romney broke his composure and went off on the guy. So, but yeah, speaking of the House, though, there's also, why don't we move into some more news? There's some congressional hearings that went on, kind of kicked off this past week on a number of things. A lot of different commentary on this, though. But Phil, what do you got on it?
Well, so the biggest thing is we've got these hearings that are in subcommittees in Judiciary and Oversight. Right. I think the one that garnered the most probably news this week was the investigations into the Twitter files. And I'll just say, right, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, this did not really go well for the Democrat or for the Republicans. Sorry. They brought in these, former Twitter executives trying to make a point about, forced censorship and stuff like that. And the Democrats, it was like Jamie Raskin, a fairly old dude that I've never heard of in my life. Doesn't surprise me for the House because there's plenty of those guys, and women out there, in the U.S. House that I don't know of. But they kind of just turned the tables, and since they're all allowed to have their however many minutes and speak and question the witnesses and stuff, and just made the whole thing look like a farce. I mean, you see that, that the whole point of that hearing with the Twitter files was to prove that Twitter was like censoring people and removing accounts, and they let Lauren Boebert get up there and talk about how she was shadow banned, and it violates all kinds of her rights. And Marjorie Taylor Greene was complaining about her Twitter account getting taken down, but it violated their policy, and they're a private company. So unless Congress decides to regulate social media, which I think a lot of people would want, unless they decide to do that, they don't really have any power. And it's not a First Amendment violation if a company tells you can't say something. Now, on the other hand, the Democrats were basically able to go and show that the White House, under the previous administration, had requested for tweets that they didn't like to be taken down, including one by celebrity, former model, cookbook author, amongst various other things, Chrissy Teigen, in which she called Trump a pussy-ass bitch. And the White House asking for tweets to be taken down is a potential First Amendment right violation. So the Democrats went to town, made this whole thing look ridiculous, which it is anyway, right? Like, I don't really agree that Democrats or Republicans should be participating in this hearing. I think it's a waste of time. But amongst that, it just doesn't seem to be going the way that Jim Jordan and various other, people want it to go.
So there are some polls out here. CNN poll from January 26 found 73% of U.S. adults think Republican leaders in the House aren't paying enough attention to the country's most important problems. February 2nd, a Navigator research poll showed 56% of Americans want Congress to focus on inflation, while only 16% of those polled said investigations are important. There's another poll, or a couple polls I saw that show the American public just want our House to focus on issues, these kitchen table issues, i.e. inflation, gas prices, China. We could go on and on. I mean, honestly, I think these hearings they'll keep going on. Are people paying attention to them? Probably not. Yeah, it's one of these things where I want to remind our listeners, it's only one portion of what's going on in the House. Yes, it's the loud portion. It's the portion getting the attention, but other committees are hard at work, working issues like, trying to come up with stuff for the debt ceiling and a lot of other things. This will get a lot of airtime.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Cam. I was going to say the exact same thing. I was just going to say that you're right. There are a lot of other things going on. Unfortunately, the C-SPAN cameras are in these rooms.
No, I know. And that's what I'm saying. It's too bad because there is a lot of work going on right now. There's this bipartisan committee they've got that's all focused on China, and everything I'm reading and hearing is that they've been doing a lot of really good work. Again, you said it, the C-SPAN cameras, CNN, you name it, right? Fox News, all the cable news networks are going to focus on these hearings. But I just wanted to remind our listeners, there is a lot of other good work going on there. These hearings, I mean, again, I'm sure we'll have more snippets and sound bites of them in the coming weeks. On to more news here as far as with, our out of Washington, D.C. Here this past week, former Vice President Mike Pence was subpoenaed, Phil. What's your take on that?
Well, he's finally going to have to go provide information. So Jack Smith subpoenaed him. Do we know a date yet?
No, I haven't seen anything like that. I just saw that he was subpoenaed. The other thing that I saw, is this just for documents? Because are they trying to subpoena documents, or do they want actual spoken testimony from Pence? And I'm not 100% sure on that one. Phil, do you have any more insight on that as to what they're after? Or maybe both, I guess, maybe both documents and testimony?
Well, again, yeah, so I don't know if I assumed it was testimony. I just assumed that he was going to have to probably give a deposition. But at the same time, keep in mind that Jack Smith is involved in these investigations. So he is not just a classified documents investigator. He's also investigating January 6th stuff. He's got multiple different prongs of this. And basically, almost simultaneously, we find out that the FBI goes in and searches Biden's home as well for more classified Pence's home for more classified documents. Now, this has been happening, obviously the result of all this classified document controversy that we're going through. But as you know, I thought Stuart Stevens said it best. I heard him on one of the news shows saying that no amount of FBI agents are going to be able to find Mike Pence's spine.
Well, you know, with all that being said, the question now is what kind of testimony they're going to get out of him. As you mentioned, if he actually gives, you know, a verbal testimony, he has dodged this in the past by using executive privilege, and Trump has tried to block it in the past as well, you know, with legal protection. The question is now, can Pence or Trump fight this off? And is Pence going to have to give the testimony? I mean, it certainly looks like he's going to, Phil. You know, and again, this is all focused around Donald Trump trying to overturn the 2020 election. I mean, is Pence going to have to testify here, or what are your thoughts on this? And then how does this help or hurt Mike Pence in his supposed quest for the White House?
Well, I'll start this answer by going back to, remember when we first heard about Jack Smith? And I think you or I or both kind of mentioned that this looks like a prosecutor that you just don't want to fuck around with. I don't think he would have dropped the subpoena if he didn't knew he was going to get the results that he wanted. So I have no doubt Pence is going to be on the hook for this one. It's pretty clear. I think almost all legal experts that you hear talk about the laws around executive privilege that only belongs to the president. I don't think he's going to get out of this one. So I think he's going to end up giving some sort of testimony, also probably providing documentation, et cetera, et cetera.
Again, how does this hurt or help Mike Pence's image?
I don't think it matters. I just don't think it matters. I mean, Mike Pence has no chance of being the next president. He was a struggling radio host prior to this that was running a, fairly marginalized campaign for governor. He doesn't have a future in politics. I mean, he has a future in news, but not in politics, right? And by a future in news, it means that pundits are going to be talking about him for the next couple of years.
All indications are he's going to try and run, as we've talked about, but he's polling very low. I mean, this is one of those things where if he testifies, depending on what he says, I mean, he could look good with a certain segment of the country, I guess, or it could look good for him. But the thing about it is by him testifying, he'll have an awful hard time, convincing the diehard Trump base that he should be the Republican nominee. So, he's going to have a hard time as it is convincing the diehard Trump base that he should be alive. No, I got it, Phil, but I'm just saying, like, that group he would have to pull onto his side to even have any hope at winning the White House or winning the nomination, I should say, would be very hard to get him. Honestly, as you just mentioned, it'd be very hard to get them anyway. So I think this is probably not going to go well for Pence and his image going forward with this.
Speaking of things that, we're all kind of paying attention to as they float through the air slowly, we talked last week about the Chinese spy balloon. Turns out now there's been several other occurrences of this. They're calling them UFOs. I don't think, have they confirmed if any of them were actual balloons yet, Cam?
So what I heard this afternoon was, I believe 2 of them they think were balloons. I thought I heard that anyway this afternoon, that I think the one over Canada and Alaska I believe I heard were balloons or some variation of a balloon. I mean, they're more like all drones anyway, but yeah, so I'm hearing that a couple of them may have been balloons. To catch our listeners up, since our last episode, we've had 3 more of these objects shot down now, one over the Yukon territories up in Canada, another one in Alaska, and then another one over one of the Great Lakes near Michigan there. I mean, it looks like now all eyes are on this. But Phil, is this just stuff that's always been there, and now we're hypersensitive and paying more attention, or is this some new threat to us? What are your thoughts?
Well, so I heard some analysis. While it was analysis, there was some speculation involved, and one of the things they were talking about is that these balloons are way more technologically savvy than ones that have been used in the past. And one of the things they were saying is in the past, the balloons just kind of floated over, but they were so high that they were never visible to the naked eye, and they didn't garner a lot of attention because they were so high up. But one of the things that they were saying is that these balloons can change altitude based on wind patterns and what it's getting in the atmosphere in order to kind of drive itself, right? Like passively drive itself based on wind. And so they're saying these things are smarter, and that's why they're getting low enough to be visible to the naked eye. And in other cases, visible to aircraft and stuff like that.
Which becomes the concern once they get low enough that they're in the way of air traffic.
Well, I think the concern is there regardless, right? I mean, I think, they said that balloon in Montana, the first one, was spotted at like 40,000 feet. Which is absolutely, in the way of aircraft. The concern should be there. Are we concerned more about aliens or China, Cam, at this point?
Hard to say. I mean, I think China presents the closer threat, if you will, the alligator closest to the boat. But as far as all this goes, right, Congress wants answers. I've heard various lawmakers out there from both sides of the aisle this past weekend on the Sunday talk shows, et cetera, saying, hey, we want answers. We want to hear more about this. It remains to be seen. I mean, they're still gathering information on these latest ones that they shot down. There's uncertainty on origin on these things too. Did they come from China? We're not even sure where they came from yet. So, I mean, who knows? Different countries, various companies, various research organizations commonly operate balloons and drones up there in that airspace. So as of right now, I just think there's a lot we don't know. And I think we're just going to have to find out about this stuff as more and more develops out of it. I mean, find out, meaning, we just need to learn a little bit more, I guess, before we can really draw any big conclusions out of this.
Yeah, couple key points on this before we move on, because we're almost ready to wrap it up. Curiosity amongst the public is palpable, right? Everybody wants to know what is going on here. We're probably not going to get the answers that are thorough enough to make everybody happy, probably even to make me happy or anybody else. Is there a possibility that these are U.S. spy balloons that just managed to make their way back home? I don't know. Crazy conspiracy theory I thought of yesterday just for the purpose of this podcast. 3, are we more on the verge of war this week than we were, 2 weeks ago?
I mean, I don't have an answer for you on that.
Yeah, I'm not trying to stoke the flames on that. It just seems like it's happening in this wave. Reminds me of that movie Independence Day. I don't know. I feel like any kind of main response that we actually get that has any kind of actual tangible information in it, no matter what it is going to go over like a lead balloon. Pardon me for that. Yeah.
Way to end that segment. So that being said, this comes to the end of our topics here for this week. We've had another great show. I just want to remind our listeners to like and follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram. Check out our website, pocketpolitics.co, where you can link up, send us an email, again, message us through social media. We'd love to hear from you, and we certainly do appreciate all of the support that you have out there. So, Phil, anything else before we wrap up?
No, I was just going to add, like, subscribe. If you're listening to the podcast, give us a 5-star rating. That helps kind of make us more visible. And we appreciate all our listeners. Tell your friends and family about us. We love the engagement. But moving on to the parting shots, Cam, I'm going to let you go this week.
Okay, well, I just want to say this. we thought politicians were only good for politics, but it turns out we're wrong, because politicians, at least some of them anyway, can actually be pretty good in the comedy avenue. So here this past week at a Washington, D.C. press club dinner, Nancy Mace got out and did a roast. And I will just say this, she did not hold back any punches. So again, Nancy Mace, Congresswoman out of South Carolina, a Republican. She was attacking Republicans. She was attacking Democrats, all of them. She was roasting Matt Gaetz, Kevin McCarthy, Ilhan Omar. I don't think anybody was safe from her that night. I even heard her digging at Raphael Warnock. So she was, all over the place with her attacks. She was very funny during this roast. I will say, I put a link up to a clip of it on our Facebook page here a few days back. For our listeners, if you haven't checked out that clip, do so. Like I said, she did a great job with it. And if you want to see the full, I think it's like 15-minute thing or whatever, it's available on YouTube. Just search it. But again, it showed a side of her that I didn't really know she had. And you know what, Congresswoman Mace, if you decide that politics isn't for you, I think you've got a future in comedy. So again, check it out. With that, Phil, over to you for your parting shot.
Yeah, but before I get into mine, I will just say that, one, I do think that she probably had some joke writing help, but it was good. And for our listeners, it is actually worth going to watch the whole thing. The short clip does a good job, but it doesn't do the entire thing justice. And it's only, like you said, I think it was like 15 or 16 minutes long, something like that.
Yep.
But with that being said, I talked about it last week. It is official now. The Kansas City Chiefs are the Super Bowl champions for this year. So, a lot of talk about some refereeing. With that being said, I will just say refereeing is part of the game, and we did it better. So, I'm sorry, Philadelphia fans, if any of our listeners don't like that, I apologize in advance, but at the end of the day, we won. And that's all I have, Cam.
All right. Well, this has been another great episode. Before we sign off, Phil, any other last words for our listeners?
No, that's all I've got. But thanks for listening, and hopefully we'll have you back in the following weeks.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much again for a great episode, Phil. Thanks to our listeners for listening. Everybody, until next time.
Bye.